It's been really interesting so far, and it's been wonderful to meet a bunch of new people as well. Just as a preface to my presentation, this is part of a larger project that I've sort of begun recently. I've been thinking about it for a really long time, but it's basically a book project about the history of the telephone in the United States, and I'm thinking of it as a cultural history of the idea of instant connection or perpetual connection. And like any project, in some ways, I'm thinking through certain features of telephone culture that are interesting to me, but I'm also reacting and arguing against some existing perspectives. So I don't know that I would call them straw men, because I actually think that they're quite solid and real. But the two things that I'm sort of thinking against are the idea of mobile phones as being unique and being a radical break from the past, that somehow in the 1990s, the mobile telephone emerges in much of Western Europe and the United States and around the world, and that this produces a different kind of life, and it's converges with the idea of internet and networked life and the ubiquity of computing, and this broader understanding of the digital condition. So what my project is really intended to do is to sort of interrogate this idea of the digital condition and instant connection. And one of the ways that I am doing this, the main way I'm doing this, is through the study of the telephone as a culture and as a technology. So one of the things that's sort of surprising about the history of the telephone in the United States, at least, is that there isn't very much history about the telephone after 1920 or 1930 and before mobile phones in the 1990s. There's this massive gap in historical consideration. There's lots of great historical work about the early years of the telephone, and very interesting work about some gendered aspects a little bit later in the 20th century, and then earlier in the 20th century, and also the labor of telephone operators and the gendered nature of that work. But there isn't very much to address these broader questions about the telephone's shaping influence on the way that, at least in the American context, people thought about how they should be able to reach each other, under which conditions, and under what circumstances a conversation, person to person, was appropriate. So I start with Steve Jobs, and this is January 9, 2007, and this is Steve Jobs walking onto the stage at his annual conference, Macworld in San Francisco, to introduce the new products of the year. So Steve Jobs' Apple presentation, his keynote, became a major event for tech aficionados. People, were waiting around to see his talk because he often unveiled a new product. He unveiled the iPod during one of these talks, and also some of these colorful Mac desktop computers during the early 21st century as well. But during this presentation, he was introducing the iPhone. And he got up on the stage and he said, this is going to be 3 products in one. It's going to be a personal music player. It's going to be a telephone, and it's also going to be a sophisticated internet navigator. And he actually stood up and said, Apple is going to revolutionize the phone. And then he said, and here it is. And the slide he showed was this. It's an iPod with a rotary dial from an old telephone photoshopped on the bottom. And the audience laughs. This is a recorded presentation. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. But he shows this before he shows the actual iPod. And what I see this as really a parting shot at the historical telephone. He's making fun of the telephone as being old-fashioned and foolish. And what he's tapping into is really this larger assumption that since the 1870s, when the telephone was invented and developed and commercialized, it's been more or less the same. It had a receiver and listening device of some type. It had some way of signaling, whether it was a dial or a crank, and it was attached by a wire to a wall. And this is the idea that the telephone has not changed. And the joke that Jobs is telling us is that the telephone is almost by definition old-fashioned. So I'll just read a little bit from my paper. it would be difficult to overstate the significance of the telephone in American life. And I should have also mentioned, I'm giving you an American story because this is what I'm familiar with, and this is what I study, and this is my area of expertise, but I'm not suggesting this is a universalizing story. Maybe it is, but that's for somebody else to decide. I think there may be comparative resonances that are useful. So the telephone is certainly important because it reshaped family dynamics and social connections, reconfigured office work, and altered expectations about the timing and place of conversation itself. As a symbol of modernity, the ubiquitous ringing telephone was, quote, akin to the ever-present tolling of church bells in medieval villages. And this is a quote from an American sociologist from the late 1960s. But despite the ubiquity and social influence, the telephone remains an enigmatic cultural object. Sociologists and media theorists have long commented on the lack of research interest in this technology. Though hundreds of millions of conversations occurred via telephone each day in the United States in the 1960s, this particular writer, a sociologist, concluded that sociologists had, quote, ignored this subject. In 1977, Étienne de Salapoule published a well-known collection, well-known among people who study the telephone, collection of essays called The Social Impact of the Telephone, and was on the centenary of the invention of the telephone. And it was designed as a way to reflect on the, quote, social impact of the telephone over 100 years. And in his introduction, he also comments on the extraordinary fact that there's very little work about history of the telephone, and this particular collection is a milestone. And then in 1992, another sociologist at Berkeley, Claude Fisher, published a social history of the telephone and concluded the same thing, that somehow the telephone had eluded scholarly interest. So this all changed at the end of the 21st century, and it wasn't that scholars suddenly decided that the telephone was fascinating. It was the mobile phone. The mobile phone emerges, and by the early 21st century, you have this outpouring of writing about mobile phones. There are articles, there are books, there are collections, there is even a new journal devoted to mobile media that's founded in 2013. So what I want to argue, though, is that the telephone, the old landline, though it is being pushed into the past, is actually extremely important today. And though the scholarship has been thin on this particular topic, the history of the telephone illuminates many of the themes that we're dealing with today. One of the one of the ways of describing the mobile phone that is memorable is Sherry Turkle's description of the mobile phone as always on and always on you. So this tethering aspect of mobile phones. And what I want to do is to illustrate some of the ways that the telephone, we've been tethered to the telephone or becoming tethered to telephones in multiple ways over 100 years. So I'm just going to skip over some of the historical comment, but so while the mobile phone is obviously important in its effect, by overlooking the historical telephone, that is the pre-mobile telephone, we miss seeing how contemporary understandings of mediated presence, time, identity, and intimacy have been shaped by the telephone and telephone culture over more than a century. It is through the history of the telephone that we begin to understand the modern history of instant connection as a technological project and social desire. By reconnecting the history of the telephone to mobile media, we can see that today's, quote, connected presence and perpetual contact are not simply functions of portability. The telephone has been pervasive in the United States since the 1920s, and its tethering effects, for good or for ill, have been felt and commented on since the late 19th century. The telephone's ubiquitous presence and beckoning ring in homes, offices, stores, hotels, public streets, all habituated Americans to new communicative demands and expectations throughout the 20th century. The telephone was not just a technology of sociability, as Claude Fisher concludes. It was also a technology of coordination, of supervision, of management, privatization, and consumer capitalism. So I just have a few slides here to illustrate the decline of the landline. This is during the 21st century, and you can see the lines going opposite directions where families in the United States that have a landline in their household declines precipitously, and the number of households where you have individuals relying on cell phones is increasing. So a changing way of communicating. And this is the cover of Claude Fisher's important book, America Calling. And in this book and in an article that appeared a couple years before, he argues that the main effect of the telephone is to encourage sociability among Americans. So what I want to do today is focus on 4 themes that I've been thinking about. I have other themes that I'm also thinking about, but in the interest of time, I'll just focus on these. And these are naturalization, mobility, commercialization, and colonization. By colonization, I mean it metaphorically, and not entirely metaphorically, but colonization of domestic space in American society in particular. So the way that the telephone became ubiquitous, became an every place device throughout the 20th century in the United States. And my contention is that mobile phones did not mark a radical break from the past. Rather, they expanded and intensified forms of instant personal communication that already existed and were cultivated by extensive experience with landline telephones over more than a century. So the title of my paper, What Was the Telephone?, is meant to be ironic. The digital world that we inhabit today is the living legacy of the 20th century telephone and telephone culture. So just to start with the idea of naturalization. As I already noted, the landline telephone is emblematic of its ordinariness. By the 1920s, most Americans regarded the telephone as a, quote, anonymous technology, so familiar and so commonplace that it was beneath comment. So when Claude Fisher was working on his sociological study of the telephone in the United States, he asked, part of his project was to ask elderly Americans during the 1990s, you know, what their recollection was of when they got their first telephone and how they used it. And he says that many of them couldn't even remember because it wasn't even remarkable. They had to be prompted, hey, you know, really, you know, what was it like? And then they would have something to say. According to the US Census, 35% of American households had a telephone in 1920. And just to put that in perspective for the United States, in 1999 or so, about 35% of Americans had cell phones. So it's kind of comparing 1920 to the very end of the 20th century. So what can or should we make of these changes in the communicative affordances of everyday life that the telephone introduced to American life? According to Claude Fisher, not much. He writes that the telephone left little lasting impression on the consciousness of Americans compared to, say, the automobile. If there's been any general change in the American psyche during the 20th century, the telephone is not responsible. So his project, I mean, to be fair to him, is empirical and very meticulously designed. He triangulates a couple of different methodologies, and you know, he really finds, you know, no evidence to suggest that there are these sort of cultural or mental or changes in consciousness, and he's reacting to earlier cultural studies of the telephone that suggest that that somehow there were these, you know, sort of larger cultural effects that that were not necessarily documented in the record of people who were talking about the telephone. So he concludes that the best estimate, he writes, is that on the whole, telephone calling solidified and deepened social relations. And he says that the telephone exerted a, quote, powerful tendency towards homeostasis. So really no effect at all. So Fisher's social history follows the history of the telephone up to approximately 1940. But the narrative arc essentially ends there because he says that by 1920 or so, the telephone had been fully domesticated in the United States. By his own admission, Fisher, that is, historical studies of the telephone are hampered by a lack of first-hand user accounts. And this is what he encountered when he was trying to study the telephone. There's very little discourse about this particular object because it was so ordinary, nobody said anything about it. But the paradox of anonymous objects is, of course, their anonymity, which is a product of the discursive silence that surrounds them and makes them unknown to future historians. However, a lack of discourse does not mean that these things were not important or that people were indifferent or viewed them as irrelevant. The fact that we don't have representative samples of Americans' comments on what they thought of the telephone during the 1920s doesn't mean that they didn't think of it or didn't think it was important. So Richard John, another media historian who writes about telecommunications in the United States, notes that the telephone underwent a process of commercialization, popularization, and naturalization at the turn of the 20th century. The final phase, naturalization, he writes, occurred around the 1910s, when the telephone became a technological and economic fact detached from the shaping influences of politics and culture. So Richard John is concerned with the political economy of telecommunications, but I would say that the same kind of argument can be applied to the idea and the naturalization of instant personal communication. If Americans no longer debated the cultural meaning of telephoning after the 1920s, which isn't entirely true, it's because speaking with others at a distance had become naturalized as a technological fact of life. For Fisher, the telephone was naturalized as a technology of sociability. Telephone users are presented as heroes in this account because, contrary to the wishes of stodgy telephone executives, they insisted on using the telephone for non-urgent, non-business conversations. This perspective not only aligns with a user-centric social shaping argument that was becoming important during the 1990s, but also it had the added virtue of discussing the role of women, because women were important in the shift towards socialization, because women were often criticized for gossiping on the telephone and causing problems. But it turns out, at least in this particular version of the history, that they influenced the way that the telephone was understood. And by the 1920s, AT&T and other telephone companies were simply marketing to use the phone for socializing. They had given up, essentially. But Fisher also assumes that a telephone call is equivalent to a face-to-face conversation. A ringing telephone is the same as a knock on one's door, and this is sort of his conclusion that, it's really no change, it's just a different technology to do the same thing. Yet I would argue the choice to call rather than to walk to a neighbor's home is not neutral. It's a historically and culturally contingent decision. The telephone may have been a technology for sociability, as Fisher contends, but the affordances of telephoning entail different communicative possibilities. The telephone, in other words, naturalized new forms of sociability. As a technology that privileged convenience and speed, the telephone naturalized a mode of personal communication rooted in efficiency and rational time management. Why walk when you can call? Something else that I would like to talk about more, but I will just note, is that one of the other things that's interesting about the telephone is that it meters conversation. Your conversation, there's a price attached to it. It's a literal cost, whereas a face-to-face conversation, there may be emotional costs and time costs, but there's no actual financial cost to meeting with someone and having a conversation. And this is, I think, important in thinking about the way that interpersonal communication is structured later on. So just to move on to mobility. What kinds of sociability did the telephone naturalize? So one of the main arguments about mobile media and mobile phones in particular is that they're revolutionary because they're portable and people can take them and speak from any location that has a signal, at least. And this is true, and this is important, of course, but it's not that telephone conversations were necessarily fixed in one place in a household or an office 400 years before the mobile phone. In fact, people were mobile and the phones were stationary. So during the 1890s, you had the first payphones that are introduced, and they're developed by an inventor in Connecticut. It's a very simple device, but you drop the coins into the slot and it signals the operator and you can make a call. The other image is a woman on a street corner using one of these payphones. So initially when landline telephones are available, grocers and pharmacists in particular would have them in their stores in the 1880s. And it became a real nuisance because customers and passersby would come in and say, hey, can I borrow your phone? And the grocer or the pharmacist would say, sure. And they'd have to sit there, and people took advantage, and people would, hang out in the pharmacy and talk to their friends. And it was very frustrating. So the payphone, at least to some degree, solved this particular kind of problem. So payphones quickly became many different varieties. You had the sort of open air payphone that the woman in the previous image is speaking on, and you begin to have enclosures. So these wooden structures that close, and they're soundproof. One of the problems with early telephones is that the speaker had to speak loudly into the mouthpiece to be heard. So there was, it was difficult to have privacy So these kinds of telephone booths provided a modicum of privacy in addition to being portable. Or I'm sorry, being out in the public so people could make their phone calls. Switch ahead, something wondered. So by 1902, there were approximately 81,000 payphones in the United States. With the installation of payphones on public streets, a New York journalist observed in 1901, quote, "You can jump off a streetcar at any corner, call up Central, and talk with your pastor or your best girl, and I have it all over in a second." So, this is mobility. You could hop on a streetcar and hop off at any time and make a call. So during the early decades of the 20th century, telephone booths appeared in a variety of shapes and designs, from capacious antechambers to compact standing enclosures. As a shared resource, public telephones required turn-taking and consideration for others. They became inconvenient when individuals monopolized the booth. A writer in 1913 complained bitterly of, quote, persons who insist on making lodging houses out of the public hello crates. So people were complaining about this. Despite these frustrations, public telephones were popular and increasingly commonplace. In 1939, the Bell system operated nearly 600,000 public telephones in the United States and processed 2 billion public telephone calls per year. So in 1939, about 8% of Bell's total call volume were public phones. Public phone booths were often in urban locations, where banks of them lined transit stations and major thoroughfares. In the 1950s, Bell telephones booths were upgraded with glass panels, and this provided some privacy in terms of your voice, but it allowed people to see into the phone booth because phone booths were problematic because crimes were committed. And some crimes were love crimes that were in telephone booths. So the glass was there to deter people from doing that. I'm going to skip forward. This is just an interesting device that is a chiffon for your chauffeur in your car. So if you're a really wealthy person, this is not a mobile phone. It's just you could speak to your chauffeur inside the car without putting down the window and have your privacy in the back. So another version of this. But here's an image from 1960 of a variety of different Bell telephone phone booths. And you can see the classic glass-shaped one, the walk-up version, and then the other is a drive-up kiosks that were often on roadsides, so people could just drive up with their car, make a phone call without getting out. And you see this connection, sort of literal connection between mobility and the automobile that Fisher suggests is so influential, and the telephone as well. So mobile telephone communication before mobile phones entailed different affordances and limitations. Callers moved through time and space, telephoning from a distributed network of public stations. Mobile phones extended and individualized the experience of mobile calling, but the practice of calling while away from home or office landlines was not novel. In fact, the ubiquity of public telephones and the sonic privacy of telephone booths suggested a version of continuous availability before mobile phones. And this is a quote from a Bell magazine writer. It says, "I must call him. I ought to call her. I wish I could call them." These were the thoughts that rattled in the minds of millions of Americans each day. And fortunately, this article explains how Bell Telephone had satisfied these demands provided an option for people who were thinking that they should or must or wish they could call someone by providing telephone booths throughout the city and towns. So the next thing I want to talk about is commercialization. While the telephone's influence on interpersonal relationships has long preoccupied sociologists and media theorists, a less examined but equally consequential aspect of telephone culture involves commercial relationships. From the beginning, the telephone was advertised as a tool for communicating with local retailers and service providers. As an early circular published in 1877 noted, commented on the domestic usefulness of the telephone and, quote, "The telephone put the user in instant communication with the grocer, the butcher, the baker, as well as over 100 other occupations." So I don't have an image of that particular claim, but this is from 1903, and it's very similar, that if you have a residential phone, your phone will put you in contact not only with emergency services, but with your grocer, your butcher, and in fact, anybody that you want to call. So by the first decade of the 20th century, the telephone commerce was spreading, and with it, public telephones, they reshaped expectations about proximity and speed. Telephone customers, as retailers often complain, could be unusually demanding and quarrelsome. So during the early part of the 20th century and into the late 19th century, grocers had telephones, so it was very common for people to call the grocer and to place an order. So most of these calls were incoming for the retailer. So department stores also set up massive banks of telephone operators to receive calls from customers placing orders. And many department stores, which were trying to distinguish themselves from cheaper dry goods dealers or discount stores, offered telephone ordering along with free delivery and charge accounts as sort of a premium service that would distinguish them. So by the turn of the 20th century, you have telephone shopping as something that's advertised and entirely common. This is an ad from 1911 showing that somebody who, focusing on a woman at home, a homemaker, that can call and have access to all of the things that they might want to access for keeping a happy home. This is an image a little later from 1934 of Marshall Field's. It's a department store, a famous department store in Chicago, and you can see all of the operators there receiving calls. Along with this particular mode of consumption, there is also the development of paper technologies, standardized order forms that are used to process the orders, to collect the information. So another aspect of the telephone and telephone culture that I'd like to address in other work is the convergence of paperwork with telephones and the way that new technology is aligned with these older forms of bureaucratic rationality. And finally, so we're familiar today with the telephone commercialization, especially with people calling us, unwanted sales calls, solicitations. So I noted that initially the calls were from shoppers calling stores, but by the early part of the 20th century, it soon became apparent that salespeople could call people at home. And this is before caller ID or any way to recognize a number that's coming in, and therefore a phone rings and you pick it up because you don't know who is calling. It might be someone important. So it's much easier to become entangled in a conversation with a salesperson on the other end. So by the early 1920s and 1930s, a new literature about telephone salesmanship emerges, and you have discussion of how to improve your telephone personality. So there are ways to make your voice give off smiles and to persuade people with your charm and magnetism via telephone. And the reason I mention this is because when we think about this kind of telegenetic performance, we can see, we can hear the echoes or the foreboding of the way that we think about social media and our presence through digital media today, where we have to cultivate a particular online or public persona or semi-public persona, and that it's this curated version of ourselves that's specific to performing on this with this particular media. So on the theme of colonization, just to return to this idea that the telephone is presented as being this unchanging technological object that is inert and is just a single thing in the historical imagination through the 20th century before the advent of mobility. And this is an ad for Western Electric from 1946 in Life magazine. Western Electric was the company that produced all of AT&T's telephone equipment. And the ad says, how many of them can you remember? And it starts in the 1870s and goes to the 1930s is the last iteration of that particular desk set, but the ad is from the 1940s. And you can see something that looks familiar. I mean, you can find a similar image that shows the progression of mobile phones, and shows this linear progress of technology. So this image, shows not only the idea that the telephone is being presented as an exemplar of technological progress and inevitability, but also that it was not static, and in fact, it was changing quite dramatically, and that people in the 1940s had to be reminded, oh yes, we did have these old-fashioned phones, and boy, we feel sorry for those people that lived back then which is the way that contemporaries often think of people that lived before mobile phones. So viewing changes in handset designs, receiver shapes, and signaling systems from magnetocranks to rotary dials, it becomes apparent that telephone technology was not settled in 1920. The history of the telephone is the history of continuous change and adaptation. It's the history of technological colonization from playthings of the affluent to ubiquitous communication. I just want to show you one more slide here. This is a 1976 Bell telephone advertisement, well, really a paean to its own success, that shows, again, the progression of the telephone from the 1870s to 1976. And here you can also see the evolution in terms of the dialing mechanisms, the shape, but also the color. One of the things that becomes important, especially after World War II in the United States, is that the telephone is aestheticized. It used to be only produced in black, and it became available in many different colors, which is a way to modernize it and a way to encourage people to introduce it into their home as something that was appealing and not just a utilitarian tool. But in more mundane ways, the telephone colonized everyday life through its various accessories and mental architecture. Telephone desk holders, handset extension brackets, headsets, neck cradles, and anti-cord tangling gadgets filled the back pages of office supply magazines. So too did telephone directory, clamps, and telephone number organizers, including forerunners of the spinning Rolodex card holder and specialized writing pads for taking notes and messages. So I have an image here of one of these handset or these telephone holders, and you could also view that as a form of mobility as well. It frees your hands and desk space to do other things, and also the importance of telephone numbers as a way to locate people, and then becoming entwined with print culture and technologies for rationalizing print culture through the management of telephone directories, but also these more personalized, customizable telephone style directories. All of this, these technological add-ons and accessories, and the omnipresence of telephone numbers coded by geography and transliterated into mnemonic slogans and trade names contributed to the broad acculturation of the telephone and telephone communication. After World War II, the telephone's colonization of domestic space accelerated. As residential service neared saturation, opportunities for growth were sought by promoting telephone ubiquity in the home. Bell marketed new phones and pushed Americans to acquire handset extensions for kitchens, bedrooms, family rooms, and even outdoors. This is a 1961 ad that appeared in a telephone company magazine that talks about this new outdoor patio phone. But what's interesting about the copy is that it makes explicit what Bell is trying to do. It's telling other affiliates of the Bell network that the company is trying to stress its the idea that the telephone can be spread and incorporated into many dimensions of everyday life. So probably the most important example of telephone extensions and aestheticization during the 1960s was the Princess phone. So this is a phone that is obviously clearly gendered in the way that it's marketed and named. It comes in multiple colors. It lights up, and there was an ad in a 1960s ad in Life magazine, and the copy says, "Promise a princess phone to someone you treasure." And this is a holiday ad, and it says, quote, "The small size of the Princess saves space wherever it's put, on the table, desk, or kitchen counter, and its modern styling lets it go anywhere in the home and go beautifully." The mutability and aestheticization of landlines, particularly during the second half of the 20th century, signaled a shift in telephone culture towards personalization. Though AT&T maintained firm control over its leased consumer telephone equipment until the late 1960s, efforts to expand its services resulted in a variety of new projects and designs, like the proliferation and privatization of televisions in the United States, which began as shared household screens, gradually multiplied and migrated into bedrooms. Home telephones began to become less like shared domestic technologies and splintered into personal extensions, often in bedrooms for private use. So this is another ad. This is, I think, from Ladies Home Journal. It says, where would you put another phone? So trying to get women to make decisions about adding telephones. And again, these extensions in numerous advertisements are proposed for basically every room in a suburban middle-class home that you could have a telephone. And many ads are emphasizing the ease and convenience and time that's saved, the safety and security and peace of mind. Some of these particular extensions were marketed as a way to give your child, particularly a teenage daughter or teenage son, their own phone. So again, this broader colonization of telephone culture before the mobile phone. In her 1991 History of the North American Telephone, Michelle Martin writes, quote, "The ahistorical contemporary mind believes the telephone as a universal, inconspicuous, and inexpensive technology which has always been accessible to the entire community." Martin's account highlights gender and class-based disparities in the formation of early 20th century telephone systems. Above all, she draws attention to the disciplinary and capitalist origins of the modern telephone. Disciplinary in its subjugation of women operators, and capitalist in its profit-driven disregard for democratizing access. If the telephone appeared universal and unremarkable at the end of the 20th century, it is because it had become so ubiquitous and so thoroughly naturalized that earlier political and cultural battles were forgotten. This process of telephone habituation occurred over decades and penetrated into the habits, routines, norms, and expectations of 20th century life. The telephone was never just a device for instant point-to-point spoken communication, nor was it ever fully domesticated or fossilized as a material artifact. And most importantly, the telephone was never really a forward-looking technology of progress. While other 19th century new media converted human thought and expression into text, telegraphic messages, photographic images, and phonographic recordings, the telephone transmitted ephemeral speech. The telephone was a technology of pre-modern orality, not rationalizing inscription. Personal conversation, not broadcasting. For these reasons, the telephone occupies an awkward place in media history. It is neither a technology of inscription nor a technology of mass communication. It is also an awkward fit into historical narratives of speed and efficiency because its messaging apparatus, speaking human bodies, are social animals, not machines. Compared to mechanized textual dispatches, real-time human conversations are often laden with phatic noise, spontaneous detours, and emotional labor. The telephone's speed was easily undone by losses in efficiency, particularly when callers encountered overly talkative or absent recipients. From the beginning, wrong numbers, busy signals, and unwanted calls were vexing telephone users. The telephone's demand for synchronous presence and its ephemerality were major liabilities. When Steve Jobs announced that Apple was reinventing the phone, he was reinventing a historically specific form of communication technology. The mobile phone and the iPhone are part of a longer history of bringing absent others into proximity. They are an extension of long-running efforts to perfect the dream of instant communication, human contact on demand, and overcoming the atomizing and alienating conditions of modernity. This is an ad from 1913 showing all the places that you could access a telephone. So it's, basically a synonym for ubiquity. It's everywhere. From this perspective, the telephone is not just a forward step in the march of progress, a technical innovation linking the telegraph to the internet in a linear narrative of improvement. Rather, the history of the telephone is better understood as a backward-looking and compensatory technology. Its developmental logic is not oriented towards the future, but toward the past and the perfection of human communication in its elemental form, embodied communication. Unlike other electric mechanical annihilators of space and time, from the telegraph and film to radio and television, the telephone offered intimacy and immediacy at pre-modern scale. The telephone constituted what modernity dissolved, private communication between co-present human bodies. And I'll stop there. Thank you.